I shall progress in three steps. At first, I'll give you more or less traditional summing up of the problem as it is seen by the usual progressives, to which, to a certain extent, I belong. Then I shall criticize that picture, and in a third move, I will offer you a few theoretical considerations concerning the undergirding, the conceptual undergirding of this problematic. But first, I will indulge in quoting to you a poem which is unfortunately in German, but I'm sure you will tolerate that. It sounds like this. It's from Brecht. Der Kommunismus ist nicht das Äußerste, was nur zu einem kleinen Teil verwirklicht werden kann, sondern wo er nicht ganz und gar verwirklicht ist. Gibt es keinen Zustand, der selbst von einem Unempfindlichen ertragbar wäre. Der Kommunismus ist wirklich die geringste Forderung, das allernächstliegende mittlere Vernünftige, which means more or less that communism is not something extreme, is the least we should demand. Well then, the triumphant thesis since the 1980s everywhere, but especially in Europe, has been that although not every kind of capitalism is democratic, all versions of democracy are by necessity capitalist. Since no modern system, particularly no variant of real socialism, was able to transcend the capitalist horizon, this is not a great discovery. As all modern political systems are based on commodity production and wage labor, ruled by value and steered by the need for accumulation, all modern democracies and non-democracies are by definition capitalist. What needs to be examined, however, is whether the dominant claim to wit that liberal, i.e. constitutional democracies, with the typical separation of powers, rule of law, human rights, civil liberties, free elections and plebiscites, sovereignty of the individual, guaranteed private property, pluralism, laicité, secularism, toleration, limits to legitimate coercion, habeas corpus, etc., are indeed reconcilable with capitalism, moreover, that capitalism is an unavoidable precondition of such a democracy. Curiously, a part of the anti-capitalist left seems to reinforce this impression by saying that liberal democracies, also known as rule of law regimes, are shaped in a way which will make possible the undisputed supremacy of capital and frequently that of the bourgeoisie. In this view, constitutional or liberal or rule of law democracy is capital's tool, so the relation between capital and this sort of democracy is not contradictory or conflictual, so they, leftists suspicious of liberal democratic smugness, do, albeit in a hostile manner, agree with the liberal and conservative establishment. But is this right? The fact is that in all historical models of liberal constitutional democracy or representative government, without exception, social and cultural hierarchy, economic oligarchy, inequality, amounting to class rule had always been the case, which means, of course, that the agency to which the idea of liberties refers is disproportionate, and societal, sometimes legal and political limitations on human, individual and group action and free choice are making a mockery of the assumption that everybody is equally free, that everybody's will has an equal impact on collective action. Hence, it would appear that capitalism does not allow the unfolding of a free society as conceived by bourgeois theory. What is important here is that it is not informal influences which preclude the realization or the full observance of valid constitutional principles. Where was I? Yes, but it is the institutional nature of capitalism that contradicts the basic tenets of bourgeois democracy itself. In this respect, we have a lot to learn from Rousseau and Robespierre. But there is something wrong with this picture. For it would mean, if this picture would be on the whole right, the uncritical acceptance of the general ideological statement of the day, namely, that representative government, rule of law, the acknowledgement of civil society and of Öffentlichkeit would amount to democracy. That is, that so-called liberal democracy is democracy. Well, this is not so self-evident. The expression liberal democracy wants to impress that the institutional order of the post-1945 West, based on various international covenants guaranteeing human and civic rights, is the equivalent of democracy, a state of affairs which offers as much, if not more, than democracy, one which is reconcilable with the dignity of free men and women. Most importantly, after the horrible experiences of modern dictatorships, it promises safety from illegitimate government interference with people's private lives and assures everyone of due process of law in case of conflict or jeopardy. Pluralism, toleration, freedom of expression, separation of church from the state, and so on, will decrease the pressure of institutional forces on private citizens. It is the classical image of negative liberty, of the absence of coercion. If there are no pre-selected groups subject to coercion and other groups exempt of it, there is a distinct possibility for political equality. If institutions are required to justify their actions that might limit individuals and groups' freedom, and this justification ought to be public and open to argument, then social conflicts are apt to be transformed into public debates in which it is not unavoidable that force be the ultimate arbiter. That's the hypothesis. Right? In modern liberal democracies, the balance between government and the governed is usually established by constitutions, a general and permanent legal framework which limits the area of political action, to which political actors will be held by courts of law. If any major element of this delicate, nay, precarious equilibrium is lacking, or if it is even possible that overturn may be merely adumbrated, there will be a feeling that freedom is in danger and that the liberal state should be assisted by non-governmental forces, civil society, public opinion, the media, political and social movements, to keep it between the designated boundaries and to help it to refrain from the temptations of arbitrary rule and from the subjugation of public interest to private ones. Such resistance consonant with the spirit of the Constitution is deemed to be legitimate, so it is untrue to say that liberal democracy needs political passivity. Civil disobedience in accordance with the spirit of the Constitution is not only admitted, but encouraged and admired. What is customarily called positive liberty, at least since Sir Isaiah Berlin's famous essay, is something that appears more and more superfluous, or better, an extreme means whereby the imperiled liberal democracy can be re-established or defended. We must not speak of regimes where there is only a semblance of liberal democracy, or where its precepts are not sincerely held, or where government abuses are making a mockery of its fundamental tenets, however frequent such phenomena may be. What is important here is to establish first what democracy is beyond its contemporary conceptual dilutions, and second, to examine whether the originary notion of democracy, culled from traditional sources and from historical intuition, can or cannot coexist with the actually dominant system, capitalism and parliamentary or liberal democracy, i.e. representative government and modern constitutionalism. In order to sum up the historical experience, we might say that democracy means the domination of the people, that is, of popular will, over the institutions. From times immemorial, elites would equate this to anarchy or worse, to the dominion of the base element over the worthy, to the supremacy of animal appetites over the intellect, to chaos, to disorder, and finally to despotism. Untutored human mind, in the absence of regulations and authority, we are told, will always therefore to be unable to deal with the complexities of public affairs, from public administration to the economy and to warfare. It has been said repeatedly, and with great passion, that people's power is power too, and that the aim of the liberal order is to tame and to neutralize power of any kind by domesticating it into being law and its execution, by replacing violence with the text. Orders, decrees, statutes, laws, constitutions are texts, not persons. It is linguistic, semantic, and conceptual abstraction, precise, unchanging in meaning, permanent, impervious to capricious improvisation, reliable, which replaces or at least softens rulers' will. If institutions, textual in nature, are subordinated to unceasing collective deliberation, influenced by passion, bias, prejudice, then freedom will not last for long. This is the age-old anti-revolutionary wisdom, which is grounded, if you pause to consider it more carefully, in a rather curious view of human society. It is no less curious by being familiar, if unexamined. Even if we accept that where there is no structure, and by structure most people mean hierarchy, there is no reason, hence unstructured human groups, masses, crowds, mobs, are purely passional, we shall have to face the fact there exist non-structural and non-institutional feats of intellect, such as poetry, says none else but Leo Strauss, accusingly in his The Three Waves of Modernity. Poetry no longer understood as inspired imitation or reproduction, but creativity, and other instances of invention, including philosophical ones. And it is precisely Leo Strauss who admits that the greatest political philosophers had never been ecclesiastics or university professors, but private gentlemen. The thesis of the exclusive reasonableness of institutions cannot account for non-mimetic intellect, not to speak of innovation coming, as it were, from outside. As there is no solitary fact of culture, all cultural facts are social, in need of understanding and reception. You cannot even affirm that beyond the institutional structures there is nothing but individuals more or less isolated. It is certainly possible to conceive of both hierarchical structure and informal social and cultural arrangements, both being processual and language-based, as institutions. Adversary culture is culture too, and counter institutions are institutions also. But if so, the exclusivity of institutional reason is thrown into disarray. In modern states, the attempts to recognize only what is formal and institutional by identifying reason as institutional and what is extra-institutional as passional are doomed to failure, however forceful and dominant. Nevertheless, as a result of extraordinarily well-entrenched mental habits and ideological clichés, la volonté générale is still believed to be an enemy of freedom. Why is that so? It would appear that this is something more than the usual upper-class state for the lowly masses. This is, it would seem, the outcome of a faulty analysis of the tragedy of the 20th century. The reigning hypothesis, the theory of totalitarianism, has been degraded to a doctrine according to which Nazi and Stalinist tyranny was somehow the expression of popular passion against liberal capitalism, fueled by envy and hatred. It is passing strange that the usual charges of statism, i.e. hyper-institutionalism, are considered in some way consubstantial with massified irrationalism and anti-institutional anger, that the greatest challenge to equality in world history, genocidal state racism, is regarded as being rooted in egalitarian fury. In this view, both revolution and counter-revolution are, regardless of their aims and social essence, are, regardless of this, expressions of irrational informality, or to put it differently, that totalitarian dictatorship is the last word of the people. By the way, if this theory, to wit that National Socialism, for example, was a result of genuine egalitarian popular passion that is affirmed in liberal theories of fascism, if this would be true, it would mean that there was indeed a Jewish world domination. And I must add here that this kind of theory of fascism, identifying fascism with irrationalism, is of course sustained by the late Georg Lukács, not late as dead, but in his late work, in Destruction of Reason, an extremely conservative work. An extremely conservative work that shows the development of real socialism in very conservative directions already in the 40s and 50s. But then, the defenders of liberal democracy will counter. Popular control of Rechtsstaat institutions is possible through periodical elections and the like. This in itself may be true, although in practice it often isn't, to a certain extent, since the choice between various representatives of the ruling class is not such a big deal after all. But the limitation on elite power, and this elite includes bureaucrats, mandarins, judges, administrators, professional politicians, military leaders and secret service bosses, and others whose interests and ideas do not always coincide with those of the grande bourgeoisie. It's not the same thing as the power of the people over the institutions of the state. I should stress that such a power does not mean the annihilation of state institutions as such, as democracy is not communism, only their subordination to popular will. The anti-democratic opinions of liberals and conservatives have a point, though. And here I must insert something so to interpret what I've said up till now. So it is basically morality, chiefly individual moral choice, moral taste, moral judgment, the jagged edge between universality and individuality, which appears as the fiery soul that doesn't fit. It would roam freely, upsetting reason and text. So a number of theoretical theses will end my my talk, and which tries to show on what these controversial views are based regarding the nature of modern capitalism. First, there is no people as such in capitalist society. Capitalist society is constituted by value. Therefore, any political community is derived from a concept. The concept is the primary in capitalism. Second, the people is secondary, as everything empirical is secondary, abgeleitet, in a capitalist society. Third, the formation of popular will, volonté générale, is impossible, not because it is inconceivable, but because even before it is delegated through the representative system, it is predetermined by the conceptual regime of value. Fourth, abstraction is not only an intellectual stratagem aimed at knowledge and generalization necessary for understanding, but also or chiefly a social nexus. This link between persons and groups where individuality is inferred from the concept, which is the veritable active feature of capitalist society, is formative as regards the institutional system, which is mirrored by the political ideology which sees everything in terms of the individual versus anything at all. Fifth, the concrete is the individual, the only concrete being recognized by bourgeois society, as opposed to the abstract and rational and conceptual reality of power, which is imagined as someone or something protected by and against this real conceptual power, as something soft defended against something hard and substantial. Sixth, so democracy in capitalist society is a myth, not a utopia, in which the will, non-institutional and non-rational, ought to be transformed by the delegation and representation of power, making it indirect, in order to become rational. Seventh, the official ideology stops short of declaring will irrational per se, as this would obliterate any reference to democracy. What will representative government represent otherwise? But it will describe it as a counterpart of freedom, this latter being described as freedom from will, as pure reason. Eighth, if democracy, popular self-determination or autonomy, is the myth of capitalism, the sort of which depends on its ability to be transmogrified into reason, what should be its utopia? Ninth, obviously its opposite, the transformation of reason into will and value into capital. If reason, a continuous repetition of institutional algorithms, replaces will and desire as motivation of collective action, or it is substituted as such, then again any limitation on power becomes impossible. So the capitalist utopia will by necessity complete the institutionalization of the social and end by relegating everything social to the role of an irrational remainder that should be conquered in order to obliterate barbarity. But of course, reason is nothing else but the conceptual, spiritual, and unified nature of capitalism, the ultimate fetish whereby, again, subjectivity is objectified and will, essentially moral choice, is subordinated to reason's textual description of itself, politics becoming the self-activity of law. 10th and the last, that's my little decalogue, right? This is then the freedom from want, but not only from scarcity, but also from desire, which, as it is corporeal, material, and wordless, is the substance of the will from which the rational being and reasoned speech will be liberated. That's the essence of capitalist utopia. Thank you.
Invite the audience to join in the discussion. Are there any questions or comments? It's okay. The microphone, please.
I was wondering whether democracy as a myth of capitalism forms a condition of reproduction of capitalism which cannot be replaced, or this myth can be can be replaced by another myth. For instance, a fascist one.
Well, since I was keeping this on a rather abstract level, I hope it was not too much more complicated than the phenomenology of the spirit. So I was keeping it at an abstract level, so that would, to a certain extent, include myth of a fascist type. Let me explain. So if indeed the essence of capitalism in this respect, and in this respect only, is a subordination of everything to a specific institutional and rational framework where also spontaneity and freedom, the market and so on, are kept immaterial and therefore spontaneous and free, because spiritual and not physical and not biological in nature. That means that will is both subordinated to the basic imperative of capitalist accumulation and self-growth of value and so on and so forth. But also, of course, this gives a special dynamism and force to the will transformed into reason in this way. This can be indeed formulated in a fascist manner, in which a body is offered to the spirit of capitalism, and in which indeed the whole of politics is transformed into a ritual performing the lacking moral choices that are lacking from the capitalist system, or in any other way. So my response is no. I think that basically this cannot be replaced within the system with another logic. There can be uprisings such as described by Signor Mattei, and there are certain parallels, because I too think that indeed the most profound nature of capitalism described by law, and by that kind of rationality best summed up by law, but also by economic theory. And so to witness the eruption of will and the body and such like into the realm of capitalism can be, and always was, always revolutionary. And this is why it still remains a scandal. There are basically two kinds of this revolutionary eruption in the world of capitalism in terms of history of ideas. The one, of course, is Rousseau, and the other, of course, is Marx. And the two, I don't think can be, even if we wish to, cannot be totally separated. For the following reasons. There is, although and I have written about the difference between Rousseauian and Marxian socialism in my class theory and such writings, but nevertheless there's a common element which is in this respect is important. Namely, both Rousseauian and Marxian theories, in their general character, and in their general character only, are theories of alienation. Both are showing how capitalist modernity is transforming the natural species Homo sapiens into a rational system of this and that, to an extent in which the reconstruction of a natural species is not any longer possible. So in this respect, a total reconstruction of a human community that is wholly natural, in this both Rousseau and Marx have been very sophisticated and pessimistic. Capitalism has operated an intervention in the history of the human soul and human morality that cannot be made totally retroactive and totally annihilated, but we are all moderns now. And so therefore, the procedures whereby desire and will is transformed by institutions and institutional discourse, whereby capitalism can be described, into reason, it is not something that we can escape totally. And as you have noticed, I too am using one of the most extreme versions of rational discourse, which is philosophy, and using it to criticize. Well, this is the same thing that has been said to you that by Mr. Hauser too, that after all, anti-Cartesian science is using Cartesian methods as well, data, measurements, figures, calculations, and so on and so forth. So of course, this is of course the paradox of radical critique. However much we may be mindful of the eruption of the alien element in capitalism's rational system by such revolutionary theories and feelings and so on and so forth, those are all the same the heirs to a millenarian development of rational thought. Aristotle is fundamental for both Rousseau and Marx. Now, so this is why I think that the myth of capitalism can be regarded from the outside if we create this outside by using the same kind of procedure, the methods of rational radical critique.
Any more questions?
My next replies will be shorter.
A comment linking with this last answer. Maybe it's not the same criteria what you are using when you are doing philosophy. Maybe what is implied in your construction, if I understood well, is that there is another rationality possible, and that's the rationality implied by the work of critique is not the same rationality you were attacking, which is too easily, which is unilateral and opposes to the bodily and as irrational. So your argument is based on another understanding of rationality, I guess. Is that so?
Well, obviously, although I haven't spoken of it, I have my own myth and my own utopia, which went unmentioned here. But of course, my hope is not different from, and in this respect is nothing new, from classical German idealism, in which, of course, a mediation of these two spheres are elaborated, and especially, of course, by Hegel, and but not exclusively. That has been always already present in Kant and Fichte and others. And so, so you see, of course, that's not my opinion that general will is irrational and bodily. That's not. That's the opposition that is alive in late capitalism and its ideology, in which political intervention described in extra-institutional framework is seen as irrational. This is indeed a transformation, as you say, a transformation of idea of reason into something hierarchical and institutional, which of course precludes critical treatments of textuality and of conceptuality. And of course it would be totally presumptuous and silly to say that some of us are not working at transformation of the situation. Of course, this has been, the work of critical philosophy and critical theory for a long time. But I wanted, of course, in this relatively short, well, not short to listen to, but short to write, in a relatively brief text, I wanted to present to you in all the rigidity of the form of contemporary ideology to show to you the force that in the contemporary world would oppose a democratic transformation. It is such a distaste for democracy and popular will and collective action that hasn't been seen from the times of restoration in the 1820s and the 1830s. And we are living in an extraordinarily reactionary period in which, of course, some kind of talk of democracy is order of the day, and I wanted to show that this talk is totally unfounded. Then the system defended today by the great and the good and by the pensée unique and all that stuff is not democracy at all. It is a well-protected and self-referential representative system which defends itself with a reference of a conceptual and textual system clothed in legal texts and in a number of prescribed procedures in which those texts have to be interpreted, construed, and applied increasingly by courts. So, and thereby, the power shifts from the executive to the judiciary, and therefore, of course, the usual physical state controls are breaking down, and indeed, popular action and collective action, being convinced by the official ideology for being as irrational as they say it is indeed making an eruption in the present system in the garb of total lack of discipline and constructivity and aims and programs and so on, in a unilateral exaggeration of spontaneity, of which, if you read your romantics carefully, you know that one major form of spontaneity is tradition. You see, indeed, that's not my image of reason and of will, but I wanted to present to you in a sharpened form, the dominant ideas more or less hidden under the immediate surface of official ideology, and which we sometimes accept too uncritically. Hence, I think that the talk about democracy on the left should be changed, at least if I'm right. But I may be wrong, but in the case I'm right, then I think that some changes are in order.
I have a
Yes.
question about Lukács, and I appreciated your criticism of the destruction of reason, but I was just thinking about the earlier Lukács and the idea of the standpoint of the proletariat as being able to see through reification because of its practical position as opposed to bourgeois reason, which Lukács describes as mainly contemplative. And so in my reading, Lukács would be a democratic thinker, at least in the early work and in the very late work. So I was just wondering, what you thought of how your Hegelianism compares to his.
Well, of course, it's an interesting case, but because of course, after all, together with Pashukanis and another few works, of course, is that study of Lukács, the reification and consciousness of the proletariat, is the only real statement of political philosophy within Marxism before recent developments. And so there, of course, there's a very strange construction about which I'm in two minds. I don't want to be too long. After all, it seems that the proletariat has two weapons, political weapons, in its fight against capitalism and the bourgeoisie and the rest. The one is, as it were, practice. This is the democratic side. It is practice in which, indeed, it puts an end to the contemplative approach to society, and in which, indeed, the approach is indistinguishable from activity. Transformative activity becomes the tool of knowledge, and vice versa. Of course, it's a very Hegelian thought, but put an extreme. That's one aspect of it, and to this extent, I agree with you. But there's another aspect, namely, that's, if you wish, the Leninist aspect, which is, of course, it was formulated better by Bloch and Lukács than by Lenin himself, but that's the role of Germany in world history to formulate in the best form the revolutions of other people. You know, the best philosophy of the French Revolution is by Kant and Fichte, isn't it? So the best interpretation of the Bolshevik Revolution is by Bloch and Lukács. So you see, the other thing is, of course, the philosophical tool of the proletariat, which is the party. Because, of course, everyday consciousness is so alienated and reified that its liberation within capitalism, well, quite similar to what I said here today, actually, is indeed impossible. So the contemplative bourgeois consciousness that has penetrated or poisoned the proletariat has to be liberated by an extreme act of intellectual violence, which is the foundation of the Communist Party, in which the proletariat is represented by philosophy, by true in the Platonic sense, true theory. And so this theory of Lukács is extremely democratic and extremely anti-democratic. It's very ambivalent. Yes. Oh no. Whatever. And his late work is very conservative. And not only The Destruction of Reason and such like, which of course was written quite similarly also by some bourgeois thinkers under the impact of Nazism. You know, if you look at Jaspers and such people, are very similar in the humanist approach against destruction of reason and so on. And I'll tell you, you know who was a thinker who appreciated very much the work, Destruction of Reason? It was somebody who I mentioned today. It was Leo Strauss, you know, the most conservative of all thinkers that can be imagined. And because indeed he had this high opinion, Aristotelian, Maimonidean idea of reason. And also the late writings of Lukács on democratization and so on after 56 and all that, well, that is a disillusioned communist's acceptance of the classical institutions. Government, the state as separated from the economy, so the limitation on government to enable economic reforms and so on and so forth, very feeble. It's basically a kind of infra-dig type of social democracy that he envisages. I mean, with the best of intentions, but nothing more. I don't think that this even then was a way out of anything. Well, of course, you know, morally it was okay that he didn't remain a Stalinist all his life. That's nice, but that's all. So the problem, of course, remains, this duality remains in the History of Class Consciousness book of Lukács too.
Okay, thank you once again. Now I have something important to announce. We are serving coffee downstairs. However, it is not allowed to bring it here to the first floor. Thank you, Gáspár Miklós, once again, and thank you all.